fine. Hello, gentle viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, Scotland's most historic street. And behind me is Boswell's Court, where James Boswell lived for much of his life. James Boswell was born in 1720, right here. He was a laird. I know that sounds like the Scots pronunciation of lord, since they change the vowel usually, but it's not quite the same. It's one down from that. Is not quite nobility, but it is still a hereditary title, laird. There are lots of lairds. There are hundreds of lairds in Scotland, while there are only dozens of lords, certainly at the time. So he was fairly wealthy and well-got, and that's what surprised many visitors to North Britain, the way that the rich and poor really lived cheek by jowl in the same tenement, which is a high-rise building. Now, for the early 18th century, that was very high-rise, as you can see, okay, 5 stories high. But that's because it's on the Royal Mile and space was very confined. It was also part of the defences of the city in former days, and to be well within the city walls. Anyway, he was academically precocious, but modern medical historians think that he may have suffered from bipolar disorder. So he started attending Edinburgh University at the incredibly early age of 13. Now, I know people grew up fast in those days, but that was really exceptional. Now, people can leave school at Scotland these days at age 17, having done exams called Highers. A lot of them, if they're trying to get into a more competitive university course, would take an extra year at school and do exams called Advanced Highers. Anyway, there were no Highers as such. So here is at Edinburgh University, and the curriculum was largely classics, Latin and ancient Greek. Even if you're studying history or philosophy, you'd be through Latin and ancient Greek a lot of the time. And he also spent some time at the University of Glasgow. So he was called to the Faculty of Advocates. That's the bar of Scotland. An advocate is a barrister or a lawyer in Scotland. So although he didn't practice law that much actually. So he was rather well travelled, spent some time in the Netherlands and did the grand tour of many Western European countries. So he was conversant in French. That was the language of an educated gentleman of any European nationality in those days. So he went to London, and just off Covent Garden, there's a pub where he famously met Samuel Johnson. Dr. Johnson, who's influenced so much of his life, this man from Leicestershire, who seemed to have suffered from something like Asperger's, who would just talk non-stop for hours. So Boswell became Dr. Johnson's amanuensis, seemingly writing down so many snippets of his incredibly witty conversation. I won't tell you too much about Dr. Johnson now, but he was one of the first lexicographers of the English language, who was rather prejudiced against the Scots, but when he met James Boswell, he somewhat changed his tune. One of his definitions in the dictionary, Dr. Johnson wrote about oats, saying something which in England is fed to horses but in Scotland supports the people, or much could be made of a Scotsman of court young, or the noblest prospect a Scotchman ever sees is the high road to England, and so forth. His snide remarks about much being made of a Scotsman of court young was in reference to Lord Mansfield, the judge. I know Mansfield takes his title from a town in Nottinghamshire, but he was in fact North British. Anyway, so going more into Boswell's Court, which is now a restaurant, and you can see, oh well, if you were able to go into it, you'd have a lovely view over Edinburgh. So he married later in life. He had 7 children with his wife. He had 2 outside wedlock, though they both died in infancy, James Boswell. In 1791, he published his Life of Johnson, which is many volumes long. It was shortly after Dr. Johnson's decease. He was one of the founders of the abolition movement in the United Kingdom, James Boswell, saying that he was going to campaign for the abolishment of servitude. There were no slaves in the United Kingdom at that time because of that Lord Mansfield's judgment in the James Somerset case, when a man in a London pub had met a young black man who'd been severely beaten up and said, "What happened to you?" And James Somerset was a black man who was held in slavery in the United Kingdom, who'd been violently abused by his master. I won't go into it, but the long and the short of it is James Somerset was set at liberty because it was found that slavery had been abolished in England and Wales in the 11th century. It can still exist in the colonies, but not in England, Wales itself. Scotland soon followed suit. So I know Peter's gone down in history as Lord Mansfield saying, "The air of England is too sweet for a slave to breathe." But Lord Mansfield's words were the rather less sonorous ones, somewhat grating to the modern ear: "The black must be discharged." But Boswell, having embraced the cause of anti-slavery, suddenly and dramatically changed his position to say that he thought that slavery must be maintained and that anti-slave rhetoric was just cant. Anyway, which would make him an unacceptable dinner guest these days. So he died in 1794. And he was a fairly well-known figure. Until the mid-20th century, many of his letters and other papers were discovered, so we know a great deal more about his life. He was a most prodigious writer, and only a fraction of his scribblings were published in his lifetime. So that is James Boswell. This is the city that raised him, inspired him, and he had a very considerable influence on the English language.